Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. What happens here? Katie. Thank you so much. Katie's written me a script. It's all about Borley Rectory, which is apparently the most haunted house in England, but is not, because hauntings are not real, or maybe they are. Maybe this will finally be the episode that makes me go, oh yeah, ghosts. Turns out those are real. Who knew? Alright, the format of the show, I've never read this before. I'm going to read it. We're going to explore it together, dear audience. Let's just jump in, shall we? The story of Borley Rectory is a nexus point between the human experience and the paranormal, combining death, sex, lies, ghosts, mysterious messages, and a psychic researcher who might not be quite what he seems. No psychic researchers are what they seem. I mean, unless you think they seem like grifters. While it burned down in dubious circumstances in 1939, Borley Rectory staked its claim in the history books as being the most haunted house in England. So let's take a spooky glide along the Nun's Walk and see what the spirits have to say about this most curious of buildings. The history of the mystery. In case you didn't know, a rectory is, I know what a rectory is, it's where the priest lives next to the church, right? Is that right? I think so. It's a home set up for the clergyman in charge of a parish, also known as a rector, and his family. Alright, close enough, right? Borley Rectory was built in 1862 and was quite a huge, sprawling thing, noted by Harry Price in his book Borley Rectory, A Century of Poltergeists as, quote, a large, rambling, uncomfortable and inconvenient house built by the Reverend Henry Bull, who was incumbent of the parish. The red brick monstrosity was enlarged in 1875, the new wing converting the existing structure into a rectangular building containing 35 rooms and almost completely enclosing a bricked courtyard. This very large house was needed for Mr. Bull's very large family. Well, it sounds kind of nice, to be honest. Like, it's got a courtyard, it's got these nice bricks, it's massive. Sounds pretty good. Indeed, Reverend Henry Bull had 14 children. I mean, it was the 19th century, though. This colossal house, basically in the middle of nowhere, soon gained a reputation for the supernatural. The figure of a ghostly nun was seen in the grounds. The Bull children saw a spectral figure in their garden that disappeared into the ether as they approached. Eventually, the story of the history of the lands where the rectory stood was uncovered. In the 1300s, a monastery had stood on the grounds at Borley. A monk from the monastery had fallen in love with a nun from the nunnery at Bures, about 9 miles... Burs? I don't know. About 9 miles south of Borley. When the forbidden love was discovered, the monk was hanged, and the poor nun was bricked up into the walls of the monastery, the place where Borley Rectory would later be built. Dun dun dun! Bricked up's intense though. That's where they like build you into a building and leave you to die in there. It's intense, dude. Just before we continue today, quick shout out from one of my absolute favorite sponsors, and that is, of course, Vessi, who sent me their new shoes. These are the Vessi Pacific sneakers. They're I would say they're like perfect for when it rains and it's the middle of summer, and then that would sound like a contradiction. But for some reason here in Prague, we are having a very rainy summer. At least so far, it's the end of July. I'm kind of hoping it'll get sunny soon. But I don't have to worry about the rain making my socks wet because I have Vessis, which are 100% waterproof, and these are also incredibly light. Like, this is a very well-made shoe, and I know that because I've worn Vessis basically constantly for 2 years. They don't fall apart on you or any of that nonsense that you can get with some other shoes. These are just well-made, fantastic shoes, lightweight, fully waterproof. Oh, and also, it's not in my talking points today, but one thing I love, you put them on, they feel a little tight, and you're like, ooh, did I order a size too small? No, just walk around with them for a little bit. They kind of form to fit your feet, which is intentional and fantastic. So, get started with Vessi and their waterproof sneakers. They got a 30-day return policy, by the way, so that's nice. And a 1-year warranty, which is even nicer. Go to vessi.com/unknown. You'll get 15% off your first pair. And now back to today's video. Another nun met a horrible fate in the 18th century. Marie Lair, a young nun from France, travelled to England as the nunnery at Bures, but met local manor owner Henry Waldengrave. They married, but Waldengrave ended up killing La in a fit of rage, burying her in the basement of his manor house. 100 years later, Reverend Henry Bull had Borley Rectory constructed on this same patch of grounds. Okay, it's fine. It's like, oh, it's built in an old graveyard. Oh, no. The ghostly nuns were a well-known sight around Borley, as the Bull children found out, with a route that one of them was seen on being referred to as Nun's Walk. As well as these unsettling visitations, a ghostly carriage driven by 2 headless coachmen was reported as being seen on the rural roads around the area. Reverend Bull died in 1892, but the Bulls remained at Borley Rectory as his son, Harry Bull, took over as rector. Harry reportedly saw headless men around the grounds, and the house was full of strange noises such as unexplained crashes, footsteps, and creaking. Harry Bull died in 1927, and ownership of Borley Rectory passed to his two younger sisters. Filling the vacant position at the rectory. Wait, so does he own it or not? I thought it was like, it's the rectory. Isn't this like, doesn't it pass on to the next person who's in charge of the church or the parish? Is a parish just like, that's just a region for a church, right? Filling the vacant position at the rectory in 1928 came Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife Mabel, recently returning from working in India. They too saw the ghost and ghost nuns, as well as hearing dragging footsteps coming from an empty room, mysterious lights shining without an apparent source, and doors opening and closing by themselves. I don't understand. The guy who built it, I guess he was like rich or something, so he's like every other vicar or whatever gonna be. I'm so confused about like the names of all these religious people, like vicar, priest, rector, father. I don't understand. I don't know what they all mean. Sorry if he's not a vicar, I apologize. No, I don't care. One day when Mabel was cleaning out, but my point was, how do these later people afford this massive house? Is it just exclusively for like rich vicars? Anyway, Mabel's clearing out these cupboards and she finds a brown paper parcel inside. And inside that parcel was a human skull. Dun, dun, dun. The activity is a ghost skull. They're haunting. The activity started ratcheting up with objects flying across rooms and disconnected bells ringing by themselves. In need of help and without knowing where to turn, the Smiths contacted the Daily Mirror newspaper, which sent one Harry Price to investigate. More on him later. Price was known as a ghost hunter and psychic researcher who had a track record of discrediting fake spiritualist mediums. So, all of them. But he's a ghost hunter at the same time. Someone needs to discredit him. It's like, you got the police, and then you got the people who police the police, like internal affairs or whatever. We need someone for that. When he arrived at Borley Rectory, Price was pelted with stones, tapping sounds were heard coming from behind a mirror, and the Smith's daughter was locked into a room that nobody had a key for. Price left without getting to the bottom of anything, and after only 9 months at Borley Rectory, the Smiths left too. The next incumbents were Reverend Lionel Foster, a man in ill health, and his wife Marianne, who was in fine health and 20 years his junior. Hey, Lionel, a player! Foyster was related to the Bulls, and the pair, plus their adopted daughter, had come from Canada to take up the position at Borley in 1930. Oh wow, this is sometime later. 30-something years later. Right from the start, the Foysters were plagued with incidents of moving and strange noises. On their very first night in the rectory, they heard a voice calling out Marianne's name and witnessed a ghostly grey figure on the stairs. Marianne seemed to be the focus of much of the activity, stating that she had been thrown out of her bed on several occasions. Strange messages started appearing on the walls of the rectory, some addressing Marianne by name and asking her to get help. The writing was messy and scribbled over itself, making it almost impossible to decipher. She wrote underneath, asking for more information, but the messages were never clear enough to understand. Reverend Foyster kept a detailed diary of the occurrences. Here's a few extracts to give you an idea. Quote, October 16th, 1930, jugs and other utensils disappearing and coming back. It sounds like you've just misplaced. It's like, where the did I leave my coffee? Where's my car? Yeah, it's by the sink. Didn't leave it there. It's like, I obviously did. Dude, it's not ghosts. Peculiar smells, especially one, this is the quote continuing by the way, especially one nearly resembling lavender, noticeable particularly in our bedroom. Bells rung, a bracelet detached from wristwatch, while Marianne is in room only a few feet away, and no one else in the house besides Adelaide, who was in her own room. Bracelet was taken and has never been seen since. Lavender bag, which no one has ever seen before, discovered on mantelpiece of Marianne's sewing room. Lavender bag disappears and again appears in my pocket. Discovered when putting on coat one morning. It sounds like you're having little blackouts, mate. It sounds like you need to go and have a brain scan or whatever they did back in the day when your brain stopped working, right? It sounds like you're just losing chunks of time. Another quote, February 26th. Books found under our bed this morning. A consignment of hymn books, unknown before, discovered on the rack over the kitchen in the afternoon. In the evening, Marianne is given a terrific blow in the eye, a cut under it. Black eye next day by an invisible assailant on the landing outside bedroom. She was carrying a candle. Did you black out and hit your wife? June the 7th, stones thrown in the evening. A chair in spare bedroom, in which Marianne was lying in bed, very unwell, twice thrown over. Strange noises heard on landing during the night. Bangs, taps on door, etc. Honestly, it just sounds like he's not very well. It sounds like he's not right upstairs. Trying to get to the bottom of these visitations, Reverend Foyster reached out to Harry Price. Price came back to Borley Rectory, but was suspicious of the Foyster story and blamed Marianne for pranking everyone and being behind the whole thing. Well, and then punching herself in the face. The Foysters didn't take that too well and sent Price packing. Eventually, after putting up with all the paranormal activity for several years and due to Lionel's worsening health, the Foysters left Borley Rectory in 1935. Foyster's diary, which he stopped writing in after a while, contained over 2,000 instances of unexplained phenomena. After giving the place time to air out a bit, there didn't seem to be any available rectors willing to come and stay in Borley Rectory, so eventually, in 1938, he should rent the place out for a year to carry out his very own investigations, but Harry Price himself. Alright, go for it, Harry. I guess the paranormal investigation field pays well. You rent this giant-ass mansion. He put an ad in the paper for volunteers and ended up with 48 people coming and staying at the house for various periods of time. Oh, okay, so not at once. It's like, Jesus, he's having a huge ghost party. And note any observations of unusual activity. During this time, Price and several other researchers carried out automatic writing sessions with a planchette, which is a small wooden plank thing you'd use on a Ouija board. It has a hole in it to hold a pen or pencil, and this creates the writing that is channeled from the spirit world. They managed to get in contact with the spirit of murdered nun Marie Lair and found out that her bones still lay in the grounds of Borley somewhere, unable to find rest. They also contacted someone who called themselves Sonex Amores and declared that the rectory would burn down, revealing the bones of a murder victim. Oh, it does burn down though, doesn't it? What a coincidence. Borley Rectory did burn down in 1939 due to the carelessness of the owner, Captain W.H. Gregson. A neighbor reported seeing a ghostly nun in the window as the flames took hold. Remembering Sonex Amores' prophecy, Harry Price returned to the rubble at Borley Rectory and discovered some bones in the wreckage of the basement. These were buried in the church grounds on the nearby village of Liston, and thus the story of what was called the most haunted house in England came to an end. But this episode doesn't. We got a long way to go. We're just a page and a bit in. Well, we're on the third page. They're double-sided, you see. Or did it? As we've revived the story of a building that burned down the best part of 90 years ago, there's obviously more going on than legend suggests. And yes, there was a lot going on behind the scenes of the purportedly haunted house. Most of it, you might be unsurprised to hear, of a rather more earthly nature. The story we heard has come together mainly through the research and writings of Harry Price. More details on him later. While he did visit and indeed live at Borley Rectory for a bit, he didn't get involved until the end of the 1920s when the Smiths asked for some professional ghost-busting help. So, can we cast any non-supernatural light on the events of the Rectory before Price entered the picture? I mean, yes, of course we can. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of this channel, this is the section where we shit all over just what we've told you. What we just told you. Yeah. Not that I haven't already started doing that already, Katie, but let's jump into it. The Bulls. Alright, let's go back to the very beginning. Borley Rectory was built in 1862 and it was allegedly haunted right from the get-go. Was it strange that a new build should attract ghostly visitors? Well, no, not if it was built on top of like that bricked up nun. She's definitely going to haunt the shit out of that house. I suppose we can overlook this point by pointing out that the rectory was built on grounds of the old monastery where the monk was hanged and the nun was walled up, so the ghosts were already there. I'm going to ask, I think the most basic thing was there actually a monastery there? I mean, is that even fact? Apart from the fact that Borley Rectory was not built on the grounds of a former monastery. Oh, what a surprise! That's just elaborated backstory in what is essentially a local ghost story. The forbidden love of a monk and a nun is great fodder for these kinds of stories, and I'm sure there are plenty of similar ones to be found in villages and towns all over the country. But what about the murdered nun called Marie Lair? Well, there are a couple of stories about the murdered woman whose identity isn't a nun at all. Also, the name Marie Lair seems to have been inserted into the story retroactively after it came up during Harry Price's seance in the late 1930s. Oh, what a surprise! It's all made up! Who would have thought? But what of all those ghostly sightings and unexplained activities that the original occupants, the Bulls, had experienced? Again, this information appears to have been added on long after the fact. In a report made in October 1986 called Borley Rectory, the most haunted house in England, a report by New Horizons Foundation of some investigations made into this alleged haunting, Jesus Christ, that's a title and a half, it states that the Bulls didn't really see much of anything during their time there. To quote it, the two Mrs. Bull and the brother, Mr. Alfred Bull, maintained that they themselves had experienced no objective phenomena during the whole of their lives there, and that the poltergeist activity was reported for the first time by the Smiths. They had, however, on one occasion collectively seen something which they took to be the ghost of the nun. Now, if you recall, there were 14 Bull children, and there was at least one Bull family member living there for a span of 65 years. So one possible sighting, possibly by a bunch of bored kids in all that time, is just not that exciting. Just after writing this, I myself spotted a ghostly white figure in my back garden, but upon closer inspection, realised it was the reflection of some thin, knotted curtains that are hanging by the patio door. You see, it's easily done. Yep, especially in the past, where like this guy, there was the guy who's just like blacking out and forgetting, in my opinion. And it's like, yeah, I mean, in the past, like carbon monoxide poisoning would make people hallucinate and stuff. That's why that's like a big thing. People think like why there were more ghosts in the past, like more ghost sightings and stuff, because people were just getting poisoned by carbon monoxide, and now they're not, because we've got carbon monoxide detectors, which is brilliant. I think we could put ghostly nuns down to local spooky tales. But what about the coach that was apparently seen going along the lanes? That might just have been a real coach. No. Further on the New Horizons Foundation report, there's an interview with Marianne Foyster, and it notes, quote, "Incidentally, Marianne has told us that Mrs. Bull kept an old-fashioned coach which was used frequently by an elderly cousin in her visits around the neighbourhood. Marianne says they used to joke about this and refer to it as the phantom coach or the headless coach, presumably referring to the alleged state of the coachman. Marianne says that she and Lionel used to say they wished the headless coach would give them a ride to Sudbury. The local bus service was pretty poor." Hilarious. So there you go. Probably nothing to that story either. Harry Bull, who took over from his father as rector of the parish, was also known to see some strange things, including a headless man in the grounds, but here there are at least two possible explanations for his sightings. The first is that Harry Bull apparently had narcolepsy and would basically fall asleep all over the place, so not much stock can be put into his supposed paranormal experiences. Wait, so how did this lavender thing get in my pocket? Well, you blacked out, Harry, didn't you? The second is that someone, let's call him Harry Price, for the sake of arguments, totally misrepresented things that had been told in order to create a more sensational story for his books. The Council for the Society of Psychical Research carried out an investigation into Price's works in 1955, although Price himself had died in 1948. They found significant differences in the original notes Price had made when interviewing the younger Bull sisters to what he actually ended up publishing in one or other of his several books concerning Borley Rectory. Here's one example, quote, "Miss Bull's recollection was that Reverend Harry Bull saw Coach, Juvenile, his retriever, terrified and growled. Saw man's legs, rest hid by fruit trees. Thought poacher, followed with Juvenile, gate shut, but saw legs disappear through gate." People in the past write so weird, it's like I feel like there's a bunch of words missing. The quote continues, when published, Price alleged of this incident that Harry Bull saw a headless man without mention of the suspicion that he might have been a poacher or tramp. Incidentally, tramps and poachers were very common in the neighbourhood. As you can see, these exaggerations and the selective wording only ends up highlighting the fact that when the Bulls lived there, nothing unusual was going on at Borley Rectory. The Smiths. Alright, now we come to Reverend G.E. Smith and his wife Mabel. If you recall, they experienced all sorts of poltergeist-type activity that seemed to be triggered after Mabel found a skull in a cupboard, as you do. As far as I could tell, the skull is a real story. Although as Reverend Smith supposedly buried it, we don't have any evidence of its existence. There are never any details given about this, just that she found it in a cupboard. Apparently it wasn't that unusual to find bits of old skeletons in the vicinity of a church, as victims of things like plagues would have been hurriedly buried, probably not that deep. The cupboard detail might have been tacked on later, as Mabel might have found it in the garden, or maybe it had been found during the Bull's tenure, been set aside for reburial and forgotten about. It is kind of creepy though that you'd move into an old house and there'd just be a human skull in the cupboard. Be like, now. Alright then, I guess it is. Even if I found that, I'd be like, it's not haunted, it's just a human skull. Someone put it there. It's not ghosts. It's a real skull though. Just creepy. Was it even a real skull? We'll never know. But we do know a lot about what was really going on at Borley during their 9-month stay. I think it was probably a real skull. Like back in the day, I don't think people, I guess like fake skulls were a thing, but I can't, it's not like they were, like fake skulls from China or whatever, like AliExpress fake skull sort of situation. By the time the Smiths moved to the rectory, it was in a really bad state. It had also been enlarged to accommodate the ever-expanding Bull family in the past, so the whole setup was really weird. As per the report by the New Horizons Foundation, Mrs. Smith described the rectory as being an enormous house with 23 rooms connected by 3 staircases on the 2 main floors, with considerable cellarage in the basement and storage room in the roof. There was no central heating, no gas or electricity or mains water. The water supply was a well in the yard. The house was cold, drafty, and depressing. It was in a considerable state of disrepair and infested with rodents. Attached was a cottage, stables, harness room, and there were 9 acres of garden. It was a daunting prospect for an elderly couple coming straight from the warm climate of India and the comparative luxury of the life of an Englishman living in the days of the Raj. Yeah. There's I don't know, I've been you get these old British houses which are like this, and they're just they're nice and big, and they've got all this history and stuff, but they're always just cold. You're like, oh, it's so cold in here. Because there's no insulation. The boiler's probably from the 1500s. As you can tell, the place was falling apart, and we can 100% put things like strange noises and the ringing of servant bells down to mice and rats, especially as it turned out that the bell system hadn't been disconnected after all. Other strange phenomena are also easily explained by the way the house was built, and therefore the acoustics that occurred. People walking past or talking outside could sound like they were coming from somewhere else. Other entities that might be opening and closing doors could be put down to local youths who had started hanging out in the interesting old building between rectors. It was big enough that intruders could remain undetected. As Marianne Foyster mentioned later on, the front door keys had been lost long ago, so it might not have even been possible to lock the place up when the Smiths were there. Well, you've not heard of replacing locks. What the hell? There was a railway line running near the rectory, and it was, in fact, the reflections of passing trains and cars that caused the mysterious lights in the windows. Shocking. The Smiths contacted the papers because they were more worried about losing their congregation due to a combination of factors. These factors were the continued stories about ghosts in the rectory, spread to the Smiths mainly by their housemaid, but also by the fact that the Smiths weren't local and weren't particularly popular. They thought that a show of an investigation into the stories might help ease fears over the scary rectory and bring more of the public in to see them. Unfortunately, it seems that the Smiths weren't that media savvy. They wrote to the Daily Mirror asking them to put them in touch with some sort of psychic investigator, and for ill or good, the paper sent them Harry Price. This is a good place to introduce him properly, as he was an interesting character. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research and the Ghost Club, which he was the chairman of after a relaunch in 1938. On the face of it, he did believe in psychic phenomena and the paranormal, and it seems quite admirable that he was investigating so-called mediums and exposing them as frauds. However, he used his own skills as a magician with a semi-well-educated background and the gift of the gab to turn events to suit him. Here's a quote from the ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalopes website. Ooh, okay, so that's something that's still around. What the fuck's a jackalope? Which gives more insight on the man. Quote, nothing better illustrates Price's true nature than his fraught relationship with Austrian psychic Rudi Schneider. Price and the SPR subjected Schneider to numerous tests and proclaimed that the young man had genuine spiritual powers. The problem was that at the same time, Price was also serving as Schneider's British booking agent, an obvious conflict of interest. The two men eventually fell out over money, and Schneider started looking for an agent willing to take a smaller cut of his earnings. Price struck back by publishing a series of photographs revealing how Schneider faked his act. He had known about the photographs for years, but sat on them until it was more profitable to expose Schneider than work with him. Schneider, what the fuck, man? Why don't you have an NDA? Just have an NDA. You work with someone, just have them have an NDA. Anyone who's employed by me, it's just like a default thing in the contract that you just sign it, you can't talk about work. I didn't even put it in there. My lawyers just draft the contracts, and it's just in there. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to take it out. Don't feel like I have anything to hide, but this guy does. So you should definitely have an NDA. So into this haunted house goes Harry Price, probably with more than half an eye on how he can turn this into a money-spinning opportunity. There's a slight fudge in the story that we originally presented as the poltergeist activity that the Smiths experienced didn't actually start until Harry Price arrived on the scene. Cue stones being thrown, objects being hurled across rooms, and the appearance of strange-looking medallions. Oh, what a surprise. Just when the paranormal investigator shows up, things start to get all paranormal, huh? How interesting. What a coincidence. Also, what's up with medallions? You guys seen that TV show? It's really compelling. I think it's called From, and it's about, these demons. These people are in this town, they're trapped in this town, they can't leave, and these demons come to, eat them. I watched it at first, and I was like, this is, really gory and not for me. But I stuck with it for a few episodes, and I'm like, now this is a really compelling show. And I said to my wife, because I'd been watching it alone, and I was like, you gotta watch this show. We should watch this show together. And she's like, all right, I'll give it a watch. She's like, dude, it's really gory. What the hell? And I'm like, just go through a few episodes. They'll get rid of the gore. Well, I think they realize that they've actually got a better show than just gore on their hands. And 5 episodes in, she's like, I'm sold. It's so compelling. It's such a good mystery. The Smiths said afterwards that they knew Price was behind these activities the whole time, as they only started when he got there, and only happened when no one was actively looking at him. You can just imagine him yelling, "What's over there?" and then lobbing a candlestick across the room when everyone was looking the other way. Fucking Price. A reporter went with Price to the rectory and at one point was hit with a stone. He was over Price's shenanigans and grabbed hold of him to empty his pockets, which turned out to be full of pebbles and stones. Of course, Price claimed that he didn't know how they got there, but nobody really believed him. Obviously, it's like, I don't know how those got there. What, you 12, Price? The medallions thing seemed a bit weird until you learned that Harry Price also had a past of faking Roman coins and the like, so this seems right up his alley. He turns up with a pocket full of stones on one side and a pocket full of medallions on the other. Price claimed that the poltergeist was attracted to his energy, which is why the activity increased when he was there. But while the Smiths seemed to have been a little daft to begin with, they didn't fall for this either. They did leave Borley Rectory after only about 9 months, but it wasn't the spirits that drove them out. It was the poor condition of the house that we mentioned earlier. In correspondence found between Price and Reverend Smith, Smith wrote, "Mrs. Smith and I would rather be left out of it. We really did not believe there were any such things as ghosts." Good. You sound sensible, Smiths. In October 1945, Mrs. Smith wrote to the church newspaper stating, "I would like to state definitively that neither my husband nor myself believed the house was haunted by anything other than rats and local superstitions. We left the rectory because of its broken down condition, but certainly found nothing to fear there." I feel like summing up this whole story could just be rats and local superstitions. She spoke to the Society of Psychical Research in 1949 after Harry Price's death and said, "I have no reason at all to think Borley was haunted." And then Price's ghost is like, "But it was!" Of course, our minds were turned towards the subject owing to so much gossip, but in spite of this, nothing occurred which could not be explained. One or two items occurred which were not explained, and I thought, that's funny, but surely such things occur in all people's lives and only means that they were unable to trace the cause. I like you. Look how sensible you are. You've got your head screwed on completely correctly. Quite so. Thank you, Mabel Smith. I think we can also put anything happening in the Smith era down to confusing acoustics, rodents in the walls, lovely, and Harry Price quickly chucking out a handful of stones when nobody's looking. Fucking Harry Price. The Foysters. Reverend Lionel Foyster and his wife Marianne, along with their adopted daughter Adelaide, were the last family to serve the parish in Borley Rectory. They arrived in 1930, about 6 months after the Smiths had left. And wait, so this place didn't have like electricity and running water and gas in the 1920s? Look, I'm not sure when that arrived, but I'm pretty sure like my nan, who was born in the 20s, had like electricity when she was a kid. Pretty sure that was standard. And there had been some renovation work carried out in between, so the place wasn't as bad as it had been before. This is an interesting era in Borley's haunted history, as it's when the writing appeared on the walls, apparently trying to communicate with Marianne. Is there some non-supernatural explanation for this? I mean, yes, there could be. And the story of the Foysters at Borley is actually one that could fill a book or a year's worth of gossip columns by itself. We mentioned before that Reverend Lionel Foyster was in pretty poor health when they arrived at Borley. He was in his 50s, but had suffered a heart attack and then started having really bad arthritis. So they'd moved back to England from Canada to get out of the wind to chill a bit. It's also mentioned a great deal that he was about 20 years older than his wife Marianne. In fact, he had been a friend of Marianne's family and had baptized her as a baby. While that sounds extremely creepy, he didn't have anything to do with her for a while she was growing up, and they met again later in life. It's a bit weird, yeah. Also, he's baptizing her when he's 20 years old? Oh, I guess this was the past. People got on with their careers real quick. It's fucking weird they did. that you married someone you knew when they were a baby and you were an adult? Bruh, come on. He did bring up this jolly anecdote when they got married, though, and the priest performing the ceremony took real offense and said that while they were legally married, it was void in the church's eyes due to the supposed spiritual relationship between the two. That's not really what you want to hear on your wedding day, so maybe the officiant should have kept his judgment to himself. But yes, it does swing more towards creepy than funny coincidence from the past. I was at a wedding. I was best man at a wedding, and I'm standing up there like as my mate's getting married, and it was a Catholic wedding, so is that like a priest? Is it a priest? Whatever. The priest, this really old dude, like he must be in his 90s, and we're like standing up there in front of the whole thing, and he's like, "And do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded husband?" And my mate just is like, he pauses, and the priest looks at him like, "You're not sure, mate?" And he's like, "I think you said husband." It's like, everyone's just like, what the f***'s happening? And then people start laughing, and the priest gets embarrassed, and we move on. But it was really like, it was quite uncomfortable. But he was like 1,000 years old, so he must be dead now. This was like a decade ago. He's probably haunting the shit out of that church. Reverend Foyster started keeping a diary of the strange happenings right from the start of their tenure at Borley, but this is also not quite as it seems. There are two things to do with this diary. The first is that both Lionel and Marianne have confirmed that he wrote it with the idea of making money from it. Why? Because they knew of the reputation of Borley before they moved there. Lionel Foyster was a relative of the original occupants, the Bulls, and had visited Borley rectory before, so he was well aware of the haunted story surrounding it. The Foysters had also lived just a few miles from a place called Amherst in Nova Scotia, where there was something which was now referred to as the Great Amherst Mystery. Let's make a note of that for a potential future episode. This was alleged poltergeist activity that happened to a woman called Esther Cox between 1878 and 1879 and was widely known about and is still reported on today. Oh my god. It's like 150 years ago, guys. Who gives a shit? So it's more than likely that the Foysters knew the story and the potential lucrative nature of having their own supernatural experiences. They were also hurting for money, so Lionel was trying to get a book written to provide for Marianne and their daughter in the case of loss of work due to his increasing frailty and potentially his demise. Well, that's very thoughtful of you. Yeah, I don't blame the hustle, man. Like, I mean, all of these guys and stuff, they know it's not real. Like, Price knows it's not real this whole time. He's just making a living off it. And I just don't like it. But, dude, if you're desperate for money, you need money. That's fine. That's fine. And if people are going to buy your dumb fiction book, well, let them be dumb. The other thing to do with his diary is that he sent it to Harry Price. Yes, that man again. This was quite a canny move on the Reverend's part, as he obviously knew that Price had been involved in trying to hype up the reputation of Borley Rectory in the past, and that he would have the necessary media contacts to publicise the book. Foyster sent Price his diary to ask his opinion, but when he tried to follow up later, Price said that he'd lost it. Foyster wrote his supposed recollections out again for publication, but never managed to finish them. Harry Price subsequently published The Most Haunted House in England, 10 Years Investigation of Borley Rectory in 1940, which gave the impression that he'd been at the rectory and witnessed and researched all these supernatural goings-on, when in fact he only went there twice at the max when the Foysters lived there, and was basically using Lionel Foyster as a literal ghostwriter. Foyster never managed to publish his manuscript, and when he died, he left it to his sister. Price then seems to have managed to get a hold of it and published another book in 1946, the year after Lionel's death, called The End of Borley Rectory, which was apparently pretty similar to the previous book. Any discrepancies between it and his earlier works are probably down to the fact that Lionel had to write out his diary twice, as Price allegedly lost the first one. How's he going to remember all the details? It's a diary. I mean, a fake diary, but still. It'd be like someone asking Katie to write this script out again from scratch. You wouldn't be able to do it. It would be very, very different. Lionel obviously wouldn't be able to remember everything he'd originally written. There we go. So there would be different, potentially conflicting information in his second manuscript. Differences between Price's books on Borley Rectory have been pointed out, and in fact, details in the second one more or less render the first book moot. But he died not long after The End of Borley Rectory was published, so probably didn't give two craps. I mean, unless he's haunting somewhere and he's like, oh, you bastards. But the good news, he's not, because ghosts aren't real. The fact that Lionel was making this stuff up for money has been confirmed by Marianne, so really not in question, and she ended up with nothing to gain from it either way. The only thing she wasn't sure of was whether Harry Price believed it or not. She didn't know if Lionel presented it to him as a work of fiction or as a genuine record of paranormal activity. As per the New Horizons Foundation report, quote, "It's not possible to ascertain so much later in time whether Foyster actually told Price that the account was fictional, or whether he deliberately allowed Price to believe it was genuine, or whether, as is most likely, Price was aware of its fictional nature, but it suited his purpose to pretend to believe it as truth." Marianne describes Price as a clever one, and is herself of the opinion that Price must have known that the diary was fictional. However, Foyster was hoping that Price would endorse the book when it was completed, a forward perhaps, and he may have been uncertain as to how Price would react to a purely fictional account, so he may have deliberately left the matter open. Yeah, as I've said many times on this show, if you're not a very good fiction writer, just say that it's fact. Just be like, it's all based on historical fact. Whatever the circumstances, I think that we have a compelling case for there being no genuine paranormal behavior at Borley Rectory, while the Foysters were there, seeing as how Lionel immediately started logging things that supposedly happened from day one, and his wife later confirmed he was making the story up, intending to cash in on it. There were so many incidents, however, that maybe some of them did happen, they just weren't caused by ghosts. One of the main things that happened while the Foysters were at Borley was the strange messages that appeared, seemingly out of thin air. They started off on scraps of paper and later migrated to the walls, mostly addressed to Marianne. She tried to communicate with the sender by writing underneath the scribbles, but a coherent message never materialized. But we all know this is fake, right? She knows this is fake, this is all just for the book. When you take a look at it, the writing looks like it was done by somebody who was a bit unhinged and always seems to be pleading for help. I mean, I'm looking at it right now. It says, Marianne, please help. Get something. Marianne, and then gibberish, and then gibberish. I mean, it's just clearly, what's the mystery? We all know it's just the guy trying to sell the book. And Marianne's playing along. It's fine. They just want some money. They just want a good fiction book. It's too hard to decipher some of the messages, but one might say, the well bothers me, which is a bit chilling when you remember that the nun, Marie Lair, and her body might be in a well. Maybe, wait, I thought she was bricked up. Maybe Marie's full name was Marianne, and she's just trying to say what happened to her. Oh, sorry, I forgot the nun's backstory wasn't real. And the seance with the name Marie Lair coming up didn't happen until after these events. Oh, it's all just nonsense. What the ghost story version of the Borley Rectory tale leaves out, maybe unsurprised to learn, is a lot of details. There was, for example, a troubled young man spending a lot of time with the Foysters during the time these writings appeared. Edwin Whitehouse had been in the First World War and his nerves had taken a battering. It's like, what did he have? Shell shock. Today called PTSD. So he was hanging out with Lionel Foster to get a bit of spiritual bearing. That was very nice. I like that. Religion is good for some shit. While he was at the rectory, however, there was an alleged uptick in the amount of poltergeist behavior. Could the spirits be attracted to Edwin's fragile psyche? Maybe, or he could have just done the messages himself. He was described as an emotionally disturbed young man, and according to the New Horizons Foundation report, quote, he was obsessed with discussing religion, could not decide whether to become a spiritualist or a Roman Catholic at one time, and he was always praying and holding long, serious conversations. He sounds like a riot. He actually ended up becoming a Benedictine monk, so there you go. Alright, I mean, he sounds fine. Sounds like he got pretty fucked up from a war, and then came back and became a monk. Wars crazy, dudes. Like First World War, those trenches, the artillery, the tanks for the first time, the machine gun for the first time, people just getting mowed down, Battle of the fucking Somme. Jesus Christ. Marianne thought it was suspicious that the messages appeared when Edwin was around and stopped after they had a cleansing ceremony at the rectory. By this point, Lionel Foyster was in a wheelchair, so he wasn't able to carry out any practical jokes that he might have perpetrated in the past. The couple also had a young daughter, who I described as an inveterate scribbler. So maybe she wrote the notes. Basically, there are at least four good mortal candidates who wrote the creepy notes before we need to peel off into the realm of dead nuns, and fake dead nuns at that. After he was unable to continue with his pranking, Lionel still had to stoke the fires of the ghostly talk. Here's what the New Horizons Foundation says about it. This is a long quote, okay? Foyster's intention was not to frighten and deceive, so much as to observe and test people's reactions to the phenomena. Marianne also says he would relate, with great relish, stories of phenomena that were alleged to have happened and which the family members present knew were not true in order to observe his visitors' reactions. In addition, the house was always wide open. The villagers came and went. Some of the rooms in the house were used for parish and church business and meetings. The only toilet facilities were upstairs, thus affording excuse for people to wander all over the house, and much of the time, she did not know who was in the house or where they were. She tells us that Lionel was very fond of children and of the local tramps and down and outs. These people were fed at the back door and allowed to sleep in the outhouse. She believes that on cold nights they crept into the kitchen for warmth. The house was never locked. The keys had long been lost. The house had 4 outer doors and 3 staircases. They also possessed a dog and a stray cat or two. I wonder what's making all the noises. It could be ghosts, or it could be the insane number of... you've got the homeless people living in the outhouse and sneaking into the kitchen. You don't have any locks. You've got rats in the walls. You've got dogs and cats and God knows what else. One could understand how easy it would be for anyone to produce fraudulent phenomenon, and it is equally easy to realize that if any genuine phenomena took place, they might not be recognized as such. And a big... the quote ends. And big if there. And there's yet another character who lived at Borley Rectory for a time, who we haven't mentioned yet. And yes, his story is a bit of a weird one. This is where the assertions we've made also get a little murky. We've been saying that Lionel was intentionally writing a fictional story. However, we only have Marianne's word for this long after Lionel's death. And as we're about to find out, she may not be the most reliable of narrators. Oh, okay, I was like, what reason does she have to lie? But I guess there might be a reason. It might be that Lionel did actually believe the things he was seeing and hearing, and Marianne just played it down afterward. For the best example of this, enter François de Halle. Now, if there weren't enough candidates for causing mischief around Borley Rectory, here's another one to throw into the mix. Early on in their stay, the Foysters decided that their young daughter was in need of a playmate, which seemed to result in them having a little French boy over to stay for a month or so. Here's Marianne's account of the arrangement, quoting, "Adelaide was lonely without other children. We answered an ad in the Times, and from this we acquired a little boy named Francois, because he's French, not Francis, Francois. He was a beautiful child, a few months younger than Adelaide, and we offered him a month's vacation. But long before that time was up, Lion and I adored him." Oh, I didn't realize Lion is short for Lionel. That's a cool short one. "And so did all who came into contact with him. Big blue eyes, brown curls, and an ever-present smile. He was a chubby lad. At no time did his father pay us anything in the line of cash. The father, Francois de Halle, visited him every weekend at first. He did some handiwork around the place and was good about the garden." All right then. Past's weird, isn't it? Just leaving your kid to go live in some random English person's house and then popping round on the weekends to do a spot of gardening. Like, what's going on? This might seem a bit of a weird way to find a friend for your child, and indeed the whole situation ends up even weirder. Francois de Halle ended up becoming a lodger at Borley Rectory, staying in an adjacent cottage, as well as being a handyman and doing stuff in the garden. Marianne and Francois ended up going into business together and opening a flower shop in Wimbledon, which is quite a distance from Borley. All right then. Dahls also experienced the hauntings at Borley, seeing a strange black shadow in his room on several occasions. Here's how Lionel Foyster tells it in his manuscript for 15 Months in a Haunted House, quote, "But on another night, a third chance presented itself. This time, it seems he was out of bed quicker than before. Good, he had got it. But what a surprise. His hands went right through the apparition, and he encountered nothing except the wall. Yet this was not all. He touched nothing, it is true, but something touched him. A terrific smack in the face is what he got for his pains. A loud cry rang through the silent house and disturbed the quiet of the night. Next morning, he appeared at the breakfast table with a black eye." Now, if you think there's something a tad fishy about this whole setup, you'd be right. Francois de Halle and Marianne started an affair not long after he moved in that lasted the best part of 3 years. I knew it was coming. I'm like, when they said flower shop in Wimbledon, I was like, oh, they're going to get naked together. They are. You know it. Whether Lionel Foyster was aware of this or not remains up for debate, but if he was, he turned a blind eye. He was in very poor health at this point, and while his relationship with Marianne lasted until his death, more or less, but we'll touch on that in a minute, they were more friends than lovers. He had also been very affected by the pronouncement of that job's worth of an officiant who declared their marriage void in the church's eyes, so maybe he felt it was okay to give his young wife a pass. Anyway, the more salient point to this story is that Dahls and Marianne's relationship was not a particularly harmonious one. Marianne said later, "After it started, I realized I had made a mistake. Because I didn't really. We fought like cats and dogs." That's quite true. If they were trying to cover for how Dahls got a black eye or how Marianne fell out of bed, blaming it on a poltergeist when there had been known poltergeist activity, seems like a reasonable solution to keep Lionel in the dark, but maybe also to spare his feelings a bit, as he probably worked out what was going on after a while. This gives a whole new meaning to things going bump in the night. What's going bump in the night? Oh, it's your wife and the handyman. Now might be a good time to add that Francois de Halle wasn't exactly a suave French flower man, as you might have been led to believe. He was actually a Cockney con man called Frank Peerless. What? While Lionel did seem to know his real identity, Marianne always referred to him as Francois de Halle in later interviews. At one point, she moved out of Borley Rectory to live with Peerless, as we'll now call him, and his son, whose real name wasn't Francois Jr., but Douglas, in their flower shop in Wimbledon. As you might have guessed, Frank Peerless wasn't really some master botanist, and they didn't grow much of anything in the rectory, and he didn't do work at the shop, so this whole thing ended up as a disaster. Marianne and Peerless broke up in 1934, and he had to be turfed out of the rectory cottage by Lionel's cousin, who was an attorney. Dude, what just happened? It's been hinted that Peerless was an accomplice to some of the poltergeist activity, especially when Harry Price appeared for the first time. Price hadn't been impressed with anything he saw and accused Marianne of doing everything, but then a bell was heard ringing by herself. Peerless wasn't with the others, so we can theorize that he was trying to help his landlords out, although Price wasn't really fooled by this either, reporting at the end of the visit that, quote, the supernatural had played no part. Marianne also thought Peerless might have been responsible for the wall writing, adding one more earthly name to the list above the fake dead nun. The Foysters eventually moved out of Borley Rectory in 1935. Lionel never got his work published, and at one point he allegedly happily posed as Marianne's father so she could get married to someone else. What is going on with your life, my dude? This would have been a bigamous marriage, and in fact, Marianne had also been married before she met Lionel. There were also rumblings of Marianne running some sort of baby farm scheme while at the rectory, but that's not relevant to the supernatural stuff, so we'll leave that alone. All right then, wait, baby farm? I'm not even sure what a baby farm is. The Foyster's time at Borley seems to have been a weird mix of sometimes seemingly believing in the ghosts, exaggerating the ghostly activity with an eye on financial gain, and using the ghosts as a handy excuse to cover up an affair. Was Lionel being cuckolded in his own house with Peerless and Marianne laughing up their sleeves every time they blamed a strange noise or sound on a poltergeist? Lionel's like, "What's that sound?" Marianne's like, "Nothing! Just the ghosts!" Oh my god, fake Frenchman, stop! Oh my god, what is going on in your lives? Was Lionel really writing a fictional diary from the start, or is that just what Marianne is telling us many years later to make him look like less of a hapless dunce and therefore make herself look a bit better too? When you know more about what was going on behind the scenes and the other people present at the rectory, the one thing we can say for sure is that it makes the possibility of a genuine poltergeist less and less likely, and we started off with it being impossible, so okay, it's less likely than impossible. Harry Price wrote at least 2 books based on supernatural goings-on at Borley, but remember, it was all coming from Lionel's diary and manuscripts that Harry Price had procured. He probably did some minimal editing to it and then had it published, allegedly. Well, Harry Price is dead. In my opinion, I think he ripped them off. I think it's pretty obvious, to be honest. There wasn't a third-party observer to most of the stuff in the books. Price himself only stopped by a couple of times, so we only have Lionel Foyster's shaky account that any of it happened at all. Harry Price. Ooh, he gets a whole section dedicated to him. All right, then. Now, speaking of Price, after the Foysters left, he rents it for a year, doesn't he? And he gets those, 45 in for some sort of ghost party. He was the next person to spend time in Borley Rectory with his gang of volunteer researchers. He had lots of seances carried out, one of which brought out the information about the nun, Marie Lair, who had been murdered and apparently buried in a well. I thought she was bricked up in a wall. Guys, get your story straight. The participants wrote a question on some paper and the medium's hands on a planchette, which was guided by a spirit to spell out responses in what's called automatic writing. Other conversations involved unnamed spirits asking for priests. The seances weren't conducted in the rectory though, but at the medium's house in London, so while I don't put a whole lot of stock in things like this anyway, to carry it out somewhere not even close to the site of the alleged body and ghost seems even less convincing. Sounds like that medium just wanted a work-from-home job. Travel out to Borley? Are you having a laugh? Come see me in London, it's fine. It's all in the spiritual realm. Doesn't matter. Price didn't live at the rectory for the year, he just rented it and popped in from time to time, but while his cast of rotating researchers noted pages upon pages of notes, it was all just the usual odd noises, cold spots, etc. that can be explained by the house's setup, mice in the walls, and all that stuff. There was once a dark figure that was seen, but it turned out to be Mrs. Arbon, the caretaker, who lived in a nearby cottage. Arbon was working there when the Foysters were living there, and while being interviewed, Marianne said the Arbons, quote, told Price a bunch of tall tales. They decided to cash in on the act independently. I mean, fair play. I'd cash in on that. Be like, yeah, sure, Price, you can come take a look around my giant house. Yeah, no, it's definitely haunted, mate. That'll be 50 quid. The writings on the wall from the Foysters' time were still there, however, and Price and his team would write beneath the wall scribbles, and a reply would sometimes appear, albeit not always legibly. But guess what? Those wall markings only appeared when Price happened to be visiting the rectory and wasn't being observed by anyone. According to orderofthejackalope.com, oh my god, that's a website. What is a jackalope? Quote, a BBC radio crew visited the rectory during his tenancy to do a story on the rectory and noticed new writing only appeared when Price was lagging behind the rest of their party and could not be seen. When they made an effort to keep him in the middle of the pack where he would be under constant scrutiny, well, the ghosts got writer's block. What, the same guy who had the medallions and the rocks in his pockets? No way. Price? Not Price. So it seems like Price was just up to his old tricks. He's a strange character. He appears to desperately want the supernatural to be real, but spends his life debunking others and creating his own tricks. Another seance predicted that the rectory would burn down that very night on March 27th, 1938, and it did burn down exactly 11 months later on the 27th of February, 1939. It only took a year. The owner was then Captain W.H. Gregson, and the fire was supposedly an accident while he was moving in. But according to the New Horizons Foundation report, quote, it was subsequently discovered that Captain Gregson had an unfortunate history where fires were concerned. Oh, he did he? Interesting. Many of his properties have been destroyed in this way, and he collected handsomely on the insurance. I don't know, the man's just like, Gregson? No insurance for you. You're in the bad boy book. So, a rather ignominious end for the famous haunted house. Harry Price again, he gets a second section. All right then. The last part of our story involved Harry Price, returning to the remains of Borley Rectory in 1943 and unearthing some bones from the cellar, presumably to confirm the information he had got from the seances that a murder victim's bones would be buried there, and to close the loop on his sensational story. Unfortunately, he seems to have got into a bit of a technical plumbing muddle. The automatic writing has been interpreted as either "the well tank bothers me" or "the well tank bottom me," which I hope means that the body is to be found at the bottom of the well tank and not anything dodgy. Anyway, Price went about digging in the cellars, as that's a logical place for something called a well tank to be. However, the Smiths had had a plumbing overhaul during their stay, and the new well tank was now located in the attic. So, how anything could be buried under that centuries after the murder occurred and the house has since been burned down is anybody's guess. Oh, it doesn't matter. Price isn't looking for facts. He's looking for money. Apparently, Price mistook a shallow trough in the cellar for the well tank and was then surprised when he found nothing under it, concluding that the well tank had vanished. In The End of Borley Rectory, he states of his failure to find the well tank. "It was inexplicable to me and was just another Borley mystery. I was so certain as to the exact position of the well that I could have found my way there in the dark." All right, Hazard. Leave it alone, Harry! It's also worth saying that the rectory had burned down in 1939 and a lot of the materials had been taken for use in the war effort. The cellar had been extensively excavated years before Price turned up again, so it's not surprising that he couldn't find what he was looking for. Here is a list of people who were there when Price dug up some bones. Reverend Henning, who was the current vicar of Borley, his wife and gardener, known only as Jackson, Captain Gregson, who'd burned the place down a few years earlier, Dr. Eric Bailey, a pathologist, and his brother, someone called Flying Officer Creamer, a somewhat odd crew, handily containing a pathologist and the former owner, who was probably desperate to make back a few pounds after messing up his insurance scam. Oh no, he messed up his insurance scam, but it sounded like he's done it so many times before, allegedly. The cellar was full of rubble, so only 2 or 3 people could fit into the area at the time to do any digging, and thanks to there being no well tank there, Price basically picked a spot at random. Guess who found the bones in the rubble? And yes, of course, it was Hazard Price. Oh, Harry, come on! Oh, you could have at least buried them before and let someone else find them. Chances are he either banked on there being some sort of bones under there, or he just planted them himself. An article called "The Well Tank Bothers Me" by Andrew Clark on foxearth.org.uk states, Jackson, a former farm labourer, immediately identified it as the jawbone of a pig. However, when it was handed to Mr. Bailey, the pathologist, it was pronounced to be human. More digging produced part of a cranium. I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that Dr. Eric Bailey was either A, not actually a pathologist, or B, a pathologist who was happy to misidentify a couple of bones for a harmless jape and probably get paid for his troubles. Yep, because Harry Price is just a bit of a con man. Subsequent excavations of the rectory found no more human bones. The supposed nun bones were not buried at Borley, as word had gotten around they were pig bones, and people got quite het up about it, but they were reburied at the nearby parish of Liston. Borley Rectory was a hot topic in the newspaper for years, so Price was getting a lot of publicity out of it during his years of visits. He died in 1948, but the debate about Borley carried on long after his death, with the Society for Psychical Research doing an investigation into his work and finding out that it basically made everything up. No, not our Harry! Off the back of the SPR's investigation, the amazingly named Chapman Pincher published an article in the Daily Express in December 1954 titled, "Was the Tale of the Roving Nun Untrue? Ghost Hunter Price Not to be Trusted." There was a rebuttal of Pincher's article published in the Psychic News a few years later in 1957, rather hilariously titled, "Borley Not Haunted? Nonsense, says the Brigadier." Well, if the Brigadier's saying it's haunted, it must be haunted. This is Brigadier C.A.L. Brownlow of Sudbury, no less, who had spoken to precisely 2 people anecdotally about seeing a couple of strange things, and after the SPR's exhaustive debunking of Price's tales, asked the reporter, "What is the evidence of the science reporter's statement?" Some people just don't want to hear what you're telling them. No, they definitely don't, and they just stop, guys. The story of Borley Rectory, then, is really the tale manufactured by Harry Price and his frequent self-insertions and meddlings into the timeline of the building's occupancy. There are no spooky photos of faces at the windows. All former occupants have confirmed that they didn't think anything supernatural was happening at the time, or if they did, it was things that can be easily explained. The whole backstory of the murdered nun was created in the late 30s by Harry Price and swung the focus of the tale to this made-up Marie-Laire instead of the nun who had been bricked up in the walls because, surprise, there had never been a monastery on the grounds where Borley Rectory stood. No, as we established extremely early on, and I guessed almost immediately, The rectory was totally demolished in the 40s and built over in the 70s. As far as I know, there have been no more occurrences of wall writing, phantom light, strange noises, or people getting hit with pedals. But maybe that's because the fake bones of the fake Marie Lair were indeed found and finally put to rest. Or none of it's real! And that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. Leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, or a rating on Spotify if you're watching on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Why not? And I'll see you in the next one.